Thanks, Julian. Welcome, everyone. Why don't we begin by asking you just to put your own Hebrew names in the chat box for a moment. And I posted at the top, by the way, if you're interested about common Hebrew names, a couple of websites. They're not endorsements of any particular website, but these are ones that I found to be handy, and a link to a beautiful rendition of Every Person Has a Name, poem by Zelda that we looked at last week, sung by Chava Alberstein. And yeah, please, let's see what your own Hebrew names are, if you have one. Maybe a Yiddish name, Hebrew name. Rachel, Miriam. Many, many years ago, I ran a campaign when I was a congregational rabbi. I'm just remembering this now, probably 30 years ago, where we had people use their Hebrew names, those who wanted to, and those who wanted to, we gave them a badge or like a tag with their Hebrew name on it, and they would wear it to shul, and suddenly people were saying Shabbat Shalom Rachel, or Shabbat Shalom Esther Fagel, or Oriel. It was really lovely. And Hebrew name is something, you know, it carry with it, we carry it with us. It's part of our identity. How often do we trot it out? In my case, especially in Minnesota, where I either get called Hyman, Haman, or now Hakim, I get to use my Hebrew name regularly with variations, with Minnesota variations. But how often do you use your Hebrew name? And I want to put 3 questions before you that I'd like us to think about. What can I learn about my biblical ancestors by understanding the meaning of their names? That's question number 1. What can I learn about my biblical ancestors by understanding the meaning of their names? What can I learn about my relationship with my biblical ancestors by understanding the meaning of their names? And finally, what can I learn about myself by understanding how the names of my biblical ancestors influence their lives? Maybe I'll post those questions in the chat. I just need to reopen a document. But, you know, I like study that's theoretical, but I also like to think about what, you know, like how can we apply what we're learning to our lives? And that's why I've been thinking about not just this class, but this question of names and naming people, and, you know, whether, here we go. You're thinking of the name that your kids may be giving a grandchild, for those who have children who have decided to have their own children, whether or not it's naming a pet, whether or not it's reflecting on the name of someone who has recently passed away, for those who are in the Daily Kaddish Minyan. So please, as we study some text, reflect on these questions. Now, I'd like to begin, and let me just share our screen, with a mystery question, and that is, what happens when Sarah has her name changed? Remember, she is originally called Sarai. First, Avraham goes through a name change, right? And God says to it's Avram, and sometimes you'll hear people still today who are called Avram and not Avraham. So God says to Avraham, as part of the promise of the Brit, of the covenant, and you shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, right? Lo yikare od shimcha Avram v'haya shimcha Avraham. And when you look at the Hebrew, right, what's the difference? It's the addition of one letter. For those who read Hebrew, it's a hey. Hey often is part of the compound series of letters that makes up the name for God. And it's just that insertion of one little hey that flips the meaning of Avraham's name. But I want to skip ahead for a moment to how Sarai is named Sarah. And that follows right after. As for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be Sarah. And again, instead of a swapping out or an addition of a letter, right, as we had with Abraham, just inserting a hey in the middle between the Av and the Ram, right, we have the Yud for Sarai, and the root word of Sarai is a sin rud resh hey, which comes from the word to rule. And Sarai, which means my princess, my royalty, what Abraham called his wife, because that's what she was named, changes to Sarah, which is more general, meaning that she's not just my princess or the royalty of my family, but her future role is going to be that of royalty of the nation that will come forth from she and her partner Avraham. Question: what happens to the Yud, the last letter of Sarai's name? It's replaced with a hey. Interesting again, hey being again not just making it a general word, but that compound root for God usually contains, God's name contains a hey. But if every letter in the Torah, according to rabbinic tradition, is supposed to be significant, where does the Yud go? So, flipping ahead, and then I'll get back to the meaning of Abraham's name in a moment. And here, we're not going to go through every source. This is just for those who like sources. Rashi basically stated here that, in other words, she's going to be a princess. She's going to be royalty, leadership to nations in general. But what happened to that Yud? Here, we have to go down generations later to Joshua, to Yehoshua. And some of you may recall that right before the incident of the 12 spies, Moshe changed Joshua's name from Hosea to Yehoshua, adding a Yud at the beginning of Joshua's name. Now this renaming, or again, this adding a letter, one letter, and I'm just realizing so far the letters that we're looking at, they're all part of the way that we use names for God, right? A Yud and a Hey together actually are part of God's name, or can be God's name standing alone. But those two letters in particular, the changes insert almost another measure of divinity into them, of Kiddusha, of holiness. We get to the renaming of Yehoshua, and we're told that the only one who has a name change, which comes at the end of all the names of the Nisi'im, the princes who were listed, this was a leadership of the time, the princely leadership that was to scout out the land and come back with an encouraging word. We know how that worked out. After the names of all those are listed, who are the princes, we read in verse 16, Eila shmot anashim asher shalach Moshe latorah haaretz, vayikra Moshe leHoshea ben Nun, Yehoshua. right? The addition of a yud. Moses changed the name of Hosea, which means, could be the imperative form of like to save. It certainly has that root. To Yehoshua, which really, without going into grammar, it's more of a jussive form of the verb, which means let him save. Let him help to save the people. It's got a very predictive power to it. Rashi notes as well, and Rashi is a medieval commentator. For those who are familiar with biblical commentators, Rashi is the first go-to if you have the background and the training. If you don't, they're better commentaries to read, quite frankly, because Rashi basically excerpts a lot of rabbinic literature, adds some grammar, because he was also a grammarian. But if you like sources, Rashi is the first go-to if you've got the background. By giving him the name Yehoshua, which is a compound of Yah and Hosea, God may save, he in effect prayed for him, may God save you from the evil counsel of the spies. However, we also know that Yehoshua again can be a different grammatical form, which means let him save. It's almost a prayer, not that may you be saved from the Meraglim, from the spies, but may you be the one to save the Jewish people from the report that the spies will ultimately give. How Moshe decided to change Yehoshua's name at this time? Why at this time? Did he have an inkling that bringing the Meraglim, the spies, into the picture was dangerous because he understood the nature of the people who was taking the risk? Don't know, but coincidentally or providentially, the name change happens right before they go to spy out the land. So, in answer to the question, what happened to the Yud from Sarah's name? And I'm not going to go into the backstory behind the Midrash, but another interpretation says, and this is not God speaking, and just as the letter Yud that I removed from the name of Sarai, wife of Abraham, when I changed her name to Sarah, was standing and screaming several years over its omission from the Bible. Not that Sarah was screaming, but the letter itself, you kind of imagine it's like suspended in time, right? It's dangling. It was divorced from the name of Sarai, and it's like, I've got a purpose. So until Yehoshua came and I added the Yud to his name, as it's stated, and Moses called Hosea the son of Nun Yehoshua. So the Yud from the name of Sarah that was suspended generations, really crying out like, don't neglect me. Every letter of Torah is precious. It's kind of like it was recycled generations, and no letter goes to waste. Now, let me stop sharing the screen for a moment, and I would love to hear, let me just take a look at any of your questions. Yeah, so David, Yitzchak. What about Yitzchak? Who was asking about Yitzchak? Yeah, dove is a Hebrew word for bear, by the way.
Looks like
I'm sorry, what?
Looks like Ronald is asking about Yitzchak. Go ahead, Ronald.
Yes.
Yeah, so what is your question about Yitzchak?
Well, when he named his son, he used the Yud. Good
point. Right? The play on words, of course, is tzachak, right? It's laughter, it's joy, because like who would have thought at that age they would finally conceive? Really good point. Thank you. And then I see something about Marioshka. I believe this is not my expertise. Probably Miriam. Miriam would be the Hebrew name in all likelihood. So we'll get into Jewish customs. By the way, I hope if we have time at the last class. If not, I'm just going to make a note to find an article, or a couple of articles on Hebrew names, changing them. Great. So what's your reaction to this midrash on the Yud? Poor Yud is screaming, it's just hovering, waiting for the moment that it can become active again. What is your response to that? And Julie, can people unmute one at a time if they would like to respond?
Yeah, you can use the raise hand function or let us know in the chat that you have a comment.
Again, looking at the several questions, what can we learn about our ancestors by understanding the meanings of their names, or our relationship to them, or our relationship? What do we learn about ourselves from name changes? Okay. It is a bit thrown off waiting so long to reuse it. Yeah, but like, why bother to look? The rabbis had a sense of humor, but they also were smart. What are they really trying to say in picking up on this? This poor cast off Yud. Well, why make a big deal out of it?
Mary, go ahead.
Hi, I'm very, very much a beginner at this, so forgive me if my question is sort of odd or simplistic.
Just
but
just give it no judgments here. We appreciate all questions.
Thank you. So my thought is I wonder if it has anything to do with the concept of the relationship between letters and numbers and their meanings and gematria, and the fact that it's not just the letter. There's a whole, there's, I don't want to say baggage, but there are ramifications and implications for every single Hebrew letter. And I just wondered if it might have something to do with that.
So first of all, that was an excellent question. I didn't look at the angle of gematria. In Hebrew, every letter has a numeric value, and lots of times, especially in some of the more mystical traditions, but even in early rabbinic tradition, you'll see rabbis trying to calculate letters, numeric values. So for example, we talk about Taryag mitzvot. You may have heard 613 mitzvot. And that's actually based on a midrash where the first two of the 10 commandments were given at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, and the people were still listening, but they became intimidated by the third and backed off. So Taryag, I believe, is like, it does a total like 611 or something, and then you add the two, you get 613. But you know what? That was meant to be a midrash. It doesn't really mean that there are 613 mitzvot that were given. That notion, and this is like the power of letters and names, it became so embedded in the Jewish people's mind that during the Middle Ages, when there wasn't much to do except try to stay alive from persecution and the Black Plague, no internet, no TV, what did rabbis do? They tried to figure out, what are the 613 mitzvot? So we have collections, starting there's the Smag and the Smach and the Rambam, and everybody's got a different collection of 613, because there probably weren't 613. But once you have this notion in your mind from this midrash, well, what do? You find them. In the same way, I would like to now check on whether or not there's any, I'm sure that there's some gematria involved in these names. I'm not a big fan of gematria, although I think sometimes it can, and by the way, for those who are, I think it's great. It's another approach in. It's just I haven't really studied it that much. But now I'm curious enough to see, okay, so what happened in terms of Gematria? So thank you for the question. The Yud, any other comments? What does it mean? Emphasize the importance of figures with letters. So I think that there's something about generational transmission, right? The traits that we have, many of them we pass on to subsequent generations. And the rabbis maybe didn't understand that psychological term, but they did understand human nature. I think they're making a very important statement in this midrash. And it's not just that every letter counts. It's just that the qualities that are embodied in our ancestors, right? And when I say ancestors, to me, that sounds like I'm too far removed from them. These are my relatives. I really, as I've gotten older, I come and I've studied more about these biblical figures. Ancestors, you know, like those are people who are dead. And these ancestors for me are my relatives because they are very much alive in me. And I think that that was a statement that this midrash is making, that, okay, Sarah and Yoshua clearly never met each other. But were some of the qualities of Sarah, of Sarai, of God's name needed at that critical moment when Yehoshua was going to have to quell a rebellion? Did Sarah have to make a very difficult judgment, right? Whether or not we agree with it, many times in her life that required a tremendous amount of strength. Absolutely. Did Yehoshua need to draw upon that strength? Yes. And I think that's what the Midrash is saying. You know, if we look more deeply into our biblical relatives, we can draw upon them for strength and for inspiration. We can try to avoid some of the mistakes that they made. I'm not saying that we should whitewash their past, but these are our people, right? Without them, we wouldn't be here. What can we learn from them? They gave us something. So that's why I think this, I am enthralled with this midrash, because it ties together the generations from Abraham and Sarah all the way to Moshe and Yehoshua, and shows that continuity. Any other questions before we move on? Raise your hand if you like that midrash. No pressure here, honestly. Okay. Yeah, something to think about. And
Had a hand up?
yeah, please.
Go ahead, Celia. Celia, you're still muted.
Hello.
Yeah, we're good.
Right. Oh, I just think it's absolutely beautiful. And as you say, it, you know, it ties, it's the continuity. We've got this thread going all the way through from the very beginning to today.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool, but I see someone really hated it.
Really?
Yes. Carol, you want to take a moment to elaborate?
Thank you.
Carol,
Hi.
if you're, yeah, hi.
It bothered me. It felt like playing around too much with the text, that this thing would just be like floating around. And it troubles me, the personification of the letter, like giving it a personality that it's crying out, that it just,
Oh,
like
interesting.
a fairy tale to me.
Okay, and why did that evoke such a, you know, we had a strong positive reaction. I'm fascinated to hear more about why that that fairy tale aspect to it evoked such a negative reaction? What was it about that?
I think when there is, and I think when Midrash is trying to fill out like a hole in a personality or something that is confusing or doesn't make sense, I don't always agree with it, but I appreciate what it's doing. Here, I really can't figure out what this is doing here, because I don't know what I just don't know what it's adding, and it troubles me because it seems so different than most of the rest of what it's not explaining a law, and it's not explaining a narrative gap that might need explanation.
Okay, so this is a different kind of midrash. Midrash generally does not explicate law unless you're looking at midrash halacha. There is a body of early midrash from around the time of the first couple of centuries CE, probably some of the material predates that explicates law. Most midrash is really either filling in a gap in a narrative, providing an alternative reading, or in this case, I like to think of midrash as midrash is created in the same way that a pearl is created. If I'm not mistaken, and sand is like the irritant. I'm sorry for mentioning oysters, but that's kind of the metaphor to get to the pearl. Sand is the irritant that produces the pearl, in the same way that a letter or even some diacritical marks, some little marks above the letters, are irritants because the rabbis are asking, why? What happened? What does it mean? So I'm glad that it evoked a strong negative reaction, because it means that there's still some irritant there. You may not change your mind, and you don't have to, because sometimes you look at things like I do and say, well, this is just nonsense. But again, the way I see it, and then we'll move on, is there's something about qualities of our ancestors that are invisible to us that sometimes wind up being an integral part of who we are. I don't need to overstate the case. And again, I think we should move on. But if something bothers you that much, to me, it's a sign it's worth thinking about again. But thank you. Okay. Now I would like us to move on. This was a great discussion, not easy to do online, by the way, so thank you. I want to take us back to names that are used in a different kind of way. We saw with Abraham, it is predictive. It's not in his lifetime that he is going to be the father of many nations, as opposed to Avram, right? The father who is sort of exalted within his family, but it's predictive. This is what will happen to him and his relatives down the road. That's us. Sarah, again, she really was the greater prophet. I mean, God says that to Abraham. So we know who really provide the leadership, the rulership within that clan, which was so critical. Nobody guaranteed that this little clan was going to make it and begin to achieve its vision. We saw that Hosea was going to confront a big crisis, and the renaming in that case was to mitigate, in a sense, the crisis that he would experience. It was predictive. We're going to need this leader so that he can save the people from themselves and their worst urges. And now we move on to the next generation, or generations. Just pull up our text again. And let's scroll back up to the birth of the twins, Yaakov and Esau. And again, if you want to talk about names and insights into names and how they define and impact upon the characters, what do they teach us about our relationship to them or ourselves from what we can glean from them, in the way that, for me, harvesting strength from that midrash where the yud becomes identified with qualities that I can draw upon, you know, when I need them. What can we learn about this next set of names? And I really want to focus on Yaakov. Love the name. Akev, heel. And how's Yaakov born? He is literally born nipping at the heel of his slightly older twin. Let's read about this. So when Rivka's time came to give birth, there were twins in her womb. Vayetzer Rishon Admoni. So the first one was a gingy, right? A redhead, and not just a redhead. I mean, kulo ki aderet se'ar. Right? It almost was. It looked like it came cloaked in a red hairy mantle. Vayikru shmo Esav. Now, Esav, another synonym for Esav that's used in the Tanakh is Seir and Esav. They're two interchangeable names that are used. In Hebrew, the word Seir is close to the word Se'ar, which means hair. So Esav is a synonym for the word hairy, literally. Pardon me. I learned in the Midwest that the way I say the word Harry is the way people say the word hairy out here. So I want to spell it. It's H-A-I-R-Y, not H-A-R-R-Y, right? He is the man of nature. Doesn't even need any clothing, right? This is like pure natural man. His twin brother comes out holding his heel. He's a striver. He wants to get out first. Ba'akev Esav. He's grabbing at the heel of Esav. So what is he called? Vayikra shmo Yaakov, right? And you can see, for those who read the Hebrew, Ba'akev Esav, so he comes out Yaakov. And was it Ronald who pointed out before that there was a yud added to Yitzchak's name? So this is great. There was a yud that's added to Akev, Yaakov. So thanks for that insight. And Yaakov literally means like a heel. I hope these parents had a therapy fund, because to name one child Harry and the other name Heel is a like destined for child therapy for a long time. But the Bible didn't care about that. The Tanakh didn't care. They're trying to tell us something that's going to become really significant as we read further on. I have to say that the next sentence, which is why I put it in bold, Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. So while Esau was truly a man of the field, Yaakov, stayed at home. But I would hardly call him an Ish Tam. Tam usually doesn't mean mild, it means simple. And one of the most complicated characters in all of Tanakh is Yaakov. And I think that sometimes, statements like this are meant to be read ironically and not just straightforward. Yaakov undergoes a name change, and I'm thinking of Ronald's insight again. We have a yud, in his other name, the name that, we're called as a Jewish people, B'nai Israel. Let's read about this, his name change. And we're going to read one midrash and then little discussion, and then we'll wrap it up. Vayivater Yaakov levado, vayeavek ish imo, ad alot hashachar. So Yaakov was left alone. He had sent, the backdrop to the scene is, he is about to confront his twin brother Esau, from whom through deception, right, he sort of grabbed what initially didn't belong to him, the birthright, and his father's blessing of the firstborn, although afterwards, Yitzchak admits that indeed Yaakov is the more rightful heir, even though he was born as the second twin. But he had to run away from his brother, who was in a murderous rage, after Yaakov had deceived his father Yitzchak, excuse me, to get the blessing of the firstborn. It's been decades, he hasn't seen him. And he is, he's frightened that he's going to die. This could be it. So he separated his family out, kind of staged them in different areas. He's got this whole elaborate plan to try to appease his brother Esau. And he remains on the other side of the ford, the Yabok, until the morning when he's confronted with this nameless Ish. Doesn't say an angel. He struggles with an Ish who is not named. It's fascinating that the characters who aren't named are as important sometimes as the characters who are. We never have the name revealed, although later on we're told it's a malach that speaks to him. That doesn't mean it was the same Ish that struggled with him. You know who else finds a mysterious Ish? The son of Yaakov, Yosef. Yosef is out wandering in the fields trying to find his brothers before his brothers abducted and sold him. And it says that Yosef stumbles upon an Ish. One of my teachers asked me a wonderful question. Think about all of the people in your life, or think of at least someone in your life. Was there ever someone in your life who functioned as that Ish? You didn't know the name of the person, and you encountered them at some point of inflection in your life, and you came across somebody and they changed your life. Did that ever happen to anyone? I want to unshare for a moment because I'm curious to see, did you ever have an encounter at an important fork in the road of your life and you bumped into someone, you may not even remember their name, they might not have been a big part of your life, but somehow they showed up at that moment and they changed the trajectory of your life?
Lior?
Actually, it's my name's Sunshine. It's Lior's my husband's name.
Oh.
I was, this is not a very Jewish sort of story, but I was going through a lot of sort of, I don't know, I was really confused about my situation, and I was also broke and in debt and living in LA way beyond my means. And I somehow met this guy who told me that there was a lama from Tibet that came to this house in Santa Monica. Mm-hmm. And I went to the house in Santa Monica, and there was indeed this lama, and everybody was bowing to him, and I was not going to bow to some lama, you know, but he gave this talk, and it was just like really kind of mind-blowing, and I ended up completely changing my life and like going on to a much happier life. I never
Thank you.
saw him again. I
No.
don't remember his name.
That, you know, that is, first of all, thank you for sharing. That is the Ish who comes along at the right moment. And maybe it's because I, you know, have been in lots of life cycle situations, the very highs and the very lows, where thank God, I'm a pretty rational person, although as I've gotten older, I am much more open to things that I used to dismiss before. It would be interesting for me, and I would encourage you to do it. After the class, just take 5 minutes and think about those chance encounters that you might have had. And I know from mine, what I have learned to try to do is to be that Ish for someone whom I know I'm never going to see again. Because I can't think of the number of times when I had the blessing of being the recipient from that Ish or Isha that just said the right thing or helped with a need. Never saw him again. So let's go back to our text. Sorry, I'm just kind of thinking right now of all the people in my life who have functioned in that way, who have been that kind of person, and it's pretty overwhelming. Okay, so Yaakov struggles with an Ish. He wants to know his name, not given the name. We don't have to know everybody's name in order to be the recipient of a blessing, of their blessing. And afterwards, what is Yaakov told? Yaakov, you know, the media it's not such a nice name at this stage. Later on it will become, but at this stage, what it means is like you're a striver. You know, you're just gonna like grab and take everything because you feel a sense of entitlement. The name change means Vayomer lo Yaakov ye'amer od shimcha. Right? Yes, you'll still have that part of you that was the striver in the negative way, but you've transcended that. Ki'im Yisrael. Now, I want you to take a look at the Hebrew word for Yisrael. It begins with that Yod again, which has the component of God, but it also contains two of the letters that are in Sarah's name. And here, without getting too mystical, although I don't actually mind if you know, you want to, because I do feel that there is something, you know, like really kind of amazing in here. It's got to be, there's some dimension that we're being asked to tune into, and that is, we've got a component of Sarah's name in here again. And Sar means, even in modern Hebrew, it means a prince. But it means, in this case, it can also mean to struggle, to strive in a good way. It doesn't mean that Yaakov will lose his instinct for striving, for succeeding, for advancing. But what it means is once you struggle with the divine and prevailed, then you have become transformed, and you deserve a different name that embodies that capacity to endure, to struggle. And it's interesting that it says Yaakov has been successful. That's not the best translation. It just means that, and you were able to take on the struggle. It's hard to say whether or not he was successful. On one level he was, because like we're called B'nai Israel, right? And we're here. On the other hand, Yaakov walks away wounded permanently. V'hu tzolea al yirecho. From that struggle, right? Yaakov walks with a limp. And again, this is why we don't eat the gid hanasheh, the thigh muscle, for those who eat meat, unless it's got to be deveined, which makes it very expensive. You know, so generally, we don't eat that portion of meat. But what's important here is that Yaakov walks away with a limp from his struggle. His successful struggle, Yisrael, that now he carries with him, means that we can be wounded, but we still have that relationship. It may even be saying that sometimes that relationship that we seek with God, you know, it can leave some scars, but we're also able to endure. And I don't, you know, it's not a theology class, but I just want to mention that I think it's significant that it says, it doesn't say that he walked away unharmed. It just says he's able to endure. And boy, that capacity is going to be characteristic of the Jewish people. We're not called B'nai Yaakov, right? We're called B'nai Israel. And when we look on further in some of the commentaries, the significance of the name change is, one, it shall no longer be said that blessings came to you through supplanting and subtlety, but through, I like this translation, through noble conduct. And that is not a typo. It's not supposed to say sarah, but srara, right? Also means nobility. Yaakov got his way through deceit, by distracting people. Not anymore. Because we can't survive through covert measures. I mean, yes, we have to do that, but you know what? To be a Jew, to be part of B'nai Israel, means that openly, proudly, right? We have to own our past and our destiny. Yaakov, if you're going to be the next part in the line of transmission, then you're going to have to learn to be more open about who you are. And yes, typically the blessing of the firstborn, of the Bechor, went to the firstborn. But what the narratives of Genesis do is upend the law of primogeniture, immediate and automatic inheritance of the firstborn. As one of my teachers said, there's birthright, right? What you're entitled to, and then there's worthright. And Yaakov, you are now worthy of the one to continue the people of Israel. In fact, we're going to name your relatives that will go forth from you as B'nai Israel, because we know that the destiny of the Jewish people is going to embody struggle, but it's going to also have the capacity to endure the struggles that we will have, both personally and collectively. Because not only does Yaakov struggle and walk away, Tzolea al Yirecho, right? He has an injury that's permanent. But we also see in his own lifetime the struggles that he encounters. His life is so far from tam, from simple, that we read about earlier, that from his earliest days, running away as a fugitive, to his dying days in Egypt, he is confronted by struggles, keeping that family together, right? Not assimilating when the family goes down to Egypt. But the operative word here is Shem Yaakov, here, Vatuchal, which means that you have prevailed or endured. And boy, is it an honor to be called B'nai Yisrael, part of that people that has endurance and a really amazing track record. Now, part of the next, or the end of this midrash that I was reading, that Yaakov can finally and openly claim his birthright, his ability to be the next in the line of leaders of the Jewish people. Part of this midrash goes back to the question where this Ish says to Yaakov, like, please stop asking me about my name already. I can't give that to you. Okay? What does the midrash say? I love this. We have no fixed names. Our names change, all depending upon the service we are commanded to carry out as the errand with which we are charged. Our names change according to the task at hand. What's your reaction to that statement? Just can raise your hand if you want Julie to unmute you or put it in the chat box. Just your initial reaction to our names change according to the task at hand. Oh, and in answer to the question from Richie, you know, Yaakov is still referred to as Yaakov afterwards because honestly, I think that he's a work in progress, as we all are. Sometimes he still resorts to the personality of Yaakov, where he uses trickery and deception. And at other times, he is starting to grow into his name. Thank you. Good question.
Okay, a few people have their hands raised. So Ellen, then Barbara, then Nancy.
Okay, two things. First of all, I wanted to say, it seems when you add the yud to the name, it elevates the character of the person. And is it because that the yud is the first letter of the tetragrammaton, you know, yud hey vav hey?
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it before like that, but I think so. What do you all think? Yeah, it kind of makes sense.
There was one other thing I wanted to say is that in the book East of Eden, there's a quote that I wrote down because it meant so much to me, and it's very apropos of what you're talking about. It says, whenever a human has a nickname, it's proof that the name given him was wrong. That was said by Samuel in East of Eden by John Steinbeck.
Would you mind putting that in the chat box? Thank you so much for enriching the discussion. Wow. And let's take some other reactions.
Barbara?
Yes, I was thinking that there's so many names of God and each one has a different purpose or a different quality that's being reflected, and just the parallel of that to, you know, our names changing in our lives and in the Torah text.
Barbara, did you ask about the names of God last week?
No.
Okay, somebody else did too. I hope we're going to be able to, I'm going to be able to focus a little bit on that next week. But yes, and we talked about that earlier, that we have that Selam Elohim in us. We have that divine image, and part of that image is that it's not fixed, right? Having different names means that we're multifaceted individuals with different aspects of personalities. A name can constrict, right, the fullness of the essence of who we are.
And we're also different names to different people.
Now I'm going to say something that may be, you know, it's a negative example. Please, somebody give me a positive one. I think of Trump's ability, his knack for tagging people with names that stick to them, because he seems to be able to caricature some aspect of personality. But boy, you know, you think about the negative aspect of growing up with a nickname that was given to you by a group of bullies, right? Or on the other hand, a name of endearment that was given to you by a teacher, you know, or by your favorite aunt or uncle, or a name of endearment by even a friend or a partner. So we see that we're not just one name. And as we grow, you know, these names may or may not influence us. But I think we want to wrap it up, and let's just conclude with, first of all, a thank you. This is my learning about how to do a new topic, and I hope I was a little more focused this week, and, you know, kind of thanks for rolling with it last week. But please reflect on what you can learn from the ancestors, from our relatives that we studied today. Okay. And what can we learn? I see, Nancy, do you have a question still? We'll get to, let me just go through these
Okay.
questions for reflections, and then if anybody wants to stay on while you ask your question, we can do that. What can you learn about our biblical relatives whom we studied? What did you learn that you didn't know before about them? Did you learn anything more? Does it change your relationship with how you view them, or can you start to think about having a relationship because these are relatives who still can be active in our lives? And what else can you learn about yourself from the way that people undergo name changes, or how their names that they're given influence who they are, whether the names that they're given or the names that they acquire?